Why is it that after years of trying to understand others, being patient, being compassionate, being willing to communicate, you suddenly find yourself no longer explaining yourself the way you once did? Why isn't it an explosion of anger, not emotional chaos, but something quieter, a kind of restraint, a growing tendency to keep more thoughts inside? And why does this shift sometimes look like distance or even coldness when you know internally it isn't indifference at all, but simply that you've been trying for a very long time and carrying more than your share? If any of this feels familiar, then today's conversation isn't about personality flaws, and it isn't about blame. We're looking instead at a psychological process that rarely gets explained clearly. What happens when you spend years empathizing, accommodating, trying to hold relationships together? What does that do to your internal emotional system? And why true clarity often doesn't arrive as emotional drama, but as the moment you finally stop continuing the exhaustion. You may have told yourself for years that your only problem is being too soft. In relationships, you instinctively try to understand first. When someone's tone shifts cold, you think, maybe they're stressed today. When plans get cancelled, you reassure yourself they've probably just been overwhelmed. At work, if responsibility gets deflected, you step in. If communication breaks down, you help stabilize it. You're sensitive to subtle mood changes, often smoothing tension before conflict escalates. Empathy itself is not weakness. Research consistently links strong empathy to social adaptability, collaborative skills, and emotional intelligence. You can read micro-expressions, notice tonal shifts, sometimes even sense emotions before they're fully spoken. The challenge is rarely the ability, it's the direction. When understanding becomes automatic, boundaries tend to move backward. You focus on why they behaved that way, but pause less often to ask, how am I actually feeling here? Over time, fatigue builds, not because you lack strength, but because you've been carrying the emotional regulation load for the relationship. Psychology sometimes calls this emotional over-responsibility. When someone repeatedly manages both their own emotions and everyone else's, the nervous system enters a slow, chronic drain. You may still appear calm, still reasonable, still supportive, but your energy gradually thins, and often this quiet depletion is exactly where change begins. Turning points rarely arrive as dramatic anger. More often, they begin as quiet awareness. One day, you notice yourself explaining their behavior again, rationalizing something that clearly crossed a boundary, translating discomfort into maybe it was just stress, or maybe I misunderstood. But this time, something pauses. You start remembering the pattern instead of the moment, the repeated hot and cold signals, the apologies that reset the cycle but never changed it, the times you questioned yourself for being too sensitive, and gradually these memories stop looking isolated, they form continuity. Psychology sometimes describes this as cognitive restructuring. When enough information accumulates, the brain reorganizes experience into a new framework. The shift isn't explosive, no slammed doors, no dramatic confrontation, just a realization. You've already tried for a very long time, so urgency fades. You stop rushing to repair, stop proving your understanding, sometimes even stop arguing. This isn't indifference, it's strategic adjustment. When emotional investment consistently lacks reciprocity, the nervous system reduces expenditure to prevent further depletion. You haven't become harsh. You've simply stopped carrying explanations that were never yours to hold. And this quiet clarity often carries more power than any emotional outburst. As clarity stabilizes, the first noticeable change usually appears in how you respond. In the past, someone else's emotional shifts immediately affected you. A heavier tone, you rushed to explain. Emotional distance, you tried to repair. Conflict rising, you often softened first. But slowly you notice something different. You don't get pulled in as quickly. During disagreement, you might listen calmly, state your position simply, and stop there. At work, if criticism turns emotional, you return to facts rather than defending feelings. This isn't emotional coldness. Neuroscience suggests that when processing shifts from limbic reactivity toward prefrontal regulation, responses become more measured, more deliberate, less reflexive. In simpler terms, you observe first, respond second. Instead of reacting instantly, this adjustment can unsettle others. They may have relied on your emotional responsiveness as relational fuel. When that fuel decreases, interaction patterns shift. You still empathize, you still understand, but you no longer prove empathy through emotional overextension. You express it through boundaries, and often this signals something important. You're putting yourself back inside the relationship, not outside it, not beneath it, back inside it. Many people assume that ending a relationship must involve conflict, but mature disengagement is often surprisingly quiet. You stop explaining your intentions repeatedly. You stop trying to make sure the other person fully understands you. And you stop proving that you meant no harm. Maybe you reduce unproductive arguments. Maybe messages become shorter. Maybe meetings grow less frequent. At work, you clarify responsibilities instead of overcompensating. In close relationships, you stop treating every emotional fluctuation as something you must repair. Psychology sometimes calls this boundary integration. Once people recognize their own needs clearly, behavior tends to stabilize, less appeasing, less reactive, more grounded. This doesn't mean you've become distant. It often means your attention is returning to essential things: rest, health, consistent relationships, your own rhythm of life. Many exits aren't formally announced. Contact simply decreases. Explanations shorten. Emotional investment fades. From the outside, everything may look calm, but internally the structure has shifted. You're no longer using relationships to confirm your worth. And when that shift happens, leaving rarely feels dramatic. It feels more like recalibration. You may be realizing something now. Your tendency to understand deeply, to tolerate, to stay patient, was never a flaw. It probably helped you maintain relationships and navigate difficult phases. But at some point, it began to cost too much. And real change usually isn't explosive, it's directional. You explain less, invest emotional energy more carefully, stop repeating conversations that never move forward, not coldness, conservation. Psychology often describes this as boundary maturation. When self-worth no longer depends on external validation, interaction naturally stabilizes. You can still empathize, still care, but you stop equating understanding with responsibility and kindness with obligation. Relationships begin to self-select. Those that can grow healthily stay. Those that cannot gradually fade. There may be no ceremony, no official ending. Yet, over time you notice, life grows quieter. Emotional expenditure decreases. Attention returns to your own center. Boundaries aren't aggression. They're information. They tell the world, you're open to connection, odd but not to chronic depletion. And this calm, steady clarity often holds more strength than confrontation ever could. This is happy psychology. May understanding bring healing, and healing bring growth. See you next time.